All right. Hello, everyone. 8:30 in the morning. I know a lot of you. It's okay. But thank you for coming. And hello, Internet Week. Are you able to see? Sorry, didn't know that. I'm James. This is me in a very large photo on a couch, an orange couch. I helped start this company called Percolate, a company I'm very proud to be a part of. We're a company located in New York City. We're a technology company that helps brands create content at social scale. It's a company I started along with my other co-founder, Noah Breyer, about 2.5 years ago. This is our logo, and throughout the presentation, you'll see I use a lot of orange. We like burnt orange. The rest of the day, though, I want to talk about brands in the social world. The reason why I'm here, the reason why I started the company, Percolate, and really how we focus on helping brands make this very big transition into this new social world that I think you have all heard a lot about over the past couple days. And in order to start to talk about it, I'll start by really speaking in metaphors and talking about how content has changed and how really content is the lifeblood of social. And I'll talk about these two terms, stock and flow, throughout the presentation to really tie the entire presentation together. And we were inspired by stock and flow a couple of years ago by a gentleman named Robin Sloan, who started the media department at Twitter. And Robin, through a blog post, was talking about this idea that content, because of social, was really changing. And so in this blog post, he theorized and he sort of defined that stock content was sort of the durable content. It was the content that sort of started the internet, right? It was the type of content that lasted for a very long time. It's the type of content that would be referential, things that you could look up in a search engine. Content that is as relevant today as it might be in 2 years or might have been 2 years ago. And Robin really defined stock content as most of the content that we had known before social. But then with social, content was changing. Content was taking a very different shape, right? A tweet was very different than a TV commercial, right? And he coined the concept of flow. And he said flow is the feed, right? It's the pieces of content that we create to remind each other that we exist, right? It's the daily and sub-daily updates that we all do in order to just be relevant in this world. And increasingly, of course, flow is what's come to define how we communicate on the internet. Stock, again, can be thought of as this beautiful piece of content on Vimeo, something that has a very long shelf life with high production value. And flow, again, is the feed. It's the tweets that we create every day. It's the daily and sub-daily updates that really don't matter in the future, right? You don't really look back on your tweets, right? They're almost ephemeral in nature. And the important thing to understand is it's not an either-or thing, right? You don't just create stock or flow, you create them both. And we're seeing great publishers do this very well. A publisher like Gawker Media is an outstanding digital social publisher that understands that it's a combination of stock and flow to really get ahead and to really engage the audience. And brands, and this is of course what I'm going to talk about in this presentation for the most part, are fantastic at creating stock content. Right? This is sort of how Madison Avenue came to be, this idea that brands communicated through media by creating beautiful, expansive pieces of content. Right? But brands, for the most part, struggle in flow. They struggle with the daily and sub-daily updates, of course, that we all can do so well. And so I would get this question when I first started Percolate, right? Noah and I would both get this. We talk about this. We talk about this idea, right? What should I tweet about? Right? And tweeting, of course, is sort of a metaphor for any sort of social content. But I always thought this was interesting. Why was I getting asked this question by CMOs, by senior marketing leaders, right? Why is this a real question? And I think as an entrepreneur, I wanted to answer this question because I was hearing it a lot. I was hearing it from people that I respected. I was hearing it from brands that I respected, brands that I knew were fantastic at creating content. And so I wanted to break the question down into its parts, right, to really understand it. And of course, this question was coming to me in the 2008, 2009 timeframe when a lot of people thought of Twitter as nothing more than what you talked about when you had breakfast in the morning, right? Twitter was for people that like to talk about what they ate in the morning. And of course, sure, certain tweets are about that, but Twitter, of course, is much more expansive than this, and they did a good job defending themselves back in the day. And of course, I'm using Twitter, but this is Facebook, this is Tumblr, this is Pinterest, this is all those platforms, right? But really, if you think about what's happening on these platforms, it's not necessarily what you ate for breakfast. It's rather what you just ate in terms of content, right? It's almost things that you ate on the internet, right? You see something interesting on the New York Times, you might tweet about it. You find a beautiful image, you might pin it, right? You see a funny video, you might share it on Facebook, right? So this is the natural behavior for human beings in these channels, as we're consuming content and we're producing out of that, right? And people, as you and I, we express ourselves through this, right? We have passions, and we take those passions and we reflect them in the content that we create on the internet, right? Social is a reflection of our attention for the most part, and our attention is a reflection of our interests. Which means that production, in order to produce content, you must consume it. Inherently, you have to. If we were to sit in the corner all day and look at a white wall, we wouldn't have anything to tweet about because we didn't consume anything. We weren't able to contextualize it, right? And we as people constantly consume. But this starts to get at the challenge. This starts to get at why this question made so much sense to us when we first started the company. Because brands don't consume content, right? Brands are not human beings, right? I think we all know that. It's a very obvious thing. But social was built for human beings. It was built for people like you and I to create content in sort of a non-professional environment. And so of course brands struggle to tweet because they don't consume, right? In this model of content, of not consuming in order to create, worked in a stock world when messages were 30 seconds long and lasted for a very long time, but breaks down in a world of flow, of always on, of pull to refresh, right? You have to consume in order to create in this new world. And of course, where you need to be in this stream, just as popular as my friends or just as interesting as my friends, we're all competing for the same time and attention in that stream. So it's very important, of course, to be timely and relevant and interesting. So how do we live in this new world, right, as brands and social? How are you relevant? How can you stay relevant? How can you keep pace, of course, with this new pace of media that we see in social? So I'm going to talk about 5 sort of key takeaways that I think are very important in terms of how we think about helping brands be relevant in a social world. So to start, I think it's very important to find your optimal mix of stock and flow content, right? Sort of the first takeaway. And this is a question that we get a lot. This is a question we get a lot from brands. I assume if you guys work with brands and in social, this question is asked a lot of you, right? What is the value of my audience? I have X million fans on Facebook, X thousand followers on Twitter, on Pinterest, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, right? What does it all mean? How can I really derive value from it, right? And this is a good question. This is the question we have to, of course, answer. And one way I like to answer this question is to look at Facebook, right? Is to look at, this is the EdgeRank algorithm, which is far more complex than I could honestly admit to trying to understand. But smart people have helped me understand how EdgeRank works. And it's pretty easy to break down at the end of the day. EdgeRank has a sort of very simple equation, which is if people don't interact with your content, then your audience doesn't exist, right? The way the news feed works is you have to have people engage with your content. And if they don't, Facebook is not going to show you they're not going to show your content to them anymore. So you could sort of just take any fan that interacts with your content and really start to think of them as your audience. And if they don't interact with your content, sure, they might like you, but they're never seeing your content, right? So of course, this means you have to create engaging content. And this is another way to think about stock and flow, right? Think of stock, think of those great, big, beautiful commercials that you create as a way to attract people, right? You attract your customers through stock content, but more and more, think about flow as keeping them engaged, right? And this is the model, of course, that you have to have in social. And the other way to think about it is promotional versus non-promotional, right? This is a struggle I think you see with a lot of brands in social. How much should I be selling versus how much should I be moving people forward and allowing them to aspire to be with my brand and to understand who we are as a brand? And one way to think about this is to think about yourself as a magazine publisher, right? You think about how a magazine publisher puts together their book. You think about any, Condé Nast, they come out with monthly publications. They think about their books in parts, right? And a magazine would have 2 parts content, 1 part ads, right? And as a brand in social, your audiences are much bigger than magazine publishers. You are 10, 100 times X the size of most magazine publishers. And you should probably take a very similar philosophy to how you communicate to those audiences in social, which is to say, 2 parts should be interesting and relevant things that you think people are going to aspire to want to hear from you about. And 1/3 can be advertising, right? It can be really promotional or sales messaging. The good news for you as the brand, of course, is that you don't have to sell advertising. You own all of it, right? It's yours to take and yours to do as you please with. So that's the first lesson. The second takeaway is this idea of figuring out your real-time inputs, figuring out how to create content in real time, just to be as interesting and relevant as possible. And to think about this, I think the first thing that we have to do is break down how stock content gets produced, right? This is the model of Madison Avenue. This is the model of how content's been created for brands for the last 60 years. And if you see the diagram shown, the brand has traditionally, from a content perspective, been in charge of the look, the feel, the voice, the messaging, right? That's been their job as a brand. And then they work in partnership with an agency. Let's just call them a creative agency usually. And the creative agency goes off and studies trends and research. Usually they buy it or they might broker it. And they glean insights from that research. And they say, to reach this target, we think we should go to market with this model, right? And then, of course, they build creative. They build the production asset, the stock piece of content, the commercial, the billboard, the spread for Vanity Fair. And you push it into market, and it works fantastically well, right? That's how stock content's worked, and there's no question it works very well. But the challenge is inherently to create it. Stock content has to move off very slow-moving trends. You can almost argue, we like to sort of joke, that most stock content is based off of evolutionary trends, right? And what's an evolutionary trend of sort of humankind, right? It's that we like each other, we like to have sex, and we like nice weather, right? Those are sort of evolutionary trends that we all can relate to. We talk about the weather, and we like sex, right? And of course, we've moved on, right? We've advanced as a civilization, and our content is much more sophisticated than that, right? The massive pieces of media that we create and push into market are much more sophisticated than just sex and nice weather. But if you look at the Super Bowl this year, this is just 4 screenshots from, of course, commercials that cost millions of dollars to produce and were put to market with tens and millions of dollars of spend behind them. You could sort of look at the insights that were gleaned in the production of these commercials, right? So that men and women like each other and they like nice weather. Right? So that's how stock content gets created, and it works, again, very well. But it breaks down in social. And so what did we do in social when we started to realize all this content was coming at us? And here's another area where I think we're going to look back and laugh at ourselves a little bit as it related to social, is we built war rooms, right? You've heard of these dashboards and places where as brands we came together and we had war rooms, something out of the Dr. Strangelove science fiction movie, where, of course, they built war rooms as a way to stop each other from nuking each other, right? It was like who was the first one that could press the button so that we killed each other, right? And we've built war rooms as a metaphor to try to understand audiences better, right? To have sort of a strategy for how we're going to interact with our audiences, right? But what's happened from that is we've lost sight of brand, right? We've lost sight of what we do as a brand. And what you've seen in social is we've started to try to ingest all of these streams of people talking about us and trying to really listen. But what it's created is a reflection of our audience, right? And that's never what brands have been about, right? We don't want to mirror our audience, right? Using the Jack Nicholson example, right? We don't want to let the inmates run the asylum, right? Our goal as a brand is to be an aspirational target, right? We have to mean something more. We have to stand for something more. We have to drive demand and awareness for our products, right? So we really need to be a magnet in these models. So we have to listen, but we have to listen to understand and then produce to be relevant. Don't listen to just react, right? Don't listen to mirror. Listen to magnet to become a magnet. And of course, this is what has been created, and this is why it's been awkward, right? This is the condescending Facebook brand page with 36,000 likes. The most popular Facebook status update for brands is like us if you like Friday, right? And that's really how brands have thought about creating content in real time. It's Friday, you should like us, right? This intersection of how they thought about creating content, it breaks down and it gets awkward over time. Consumers understand this and they realize this. And so we have to get better, of course, as an industry to move the content forward. So what's the takeaway from all this as it relates to figuring out your real-time inputs? Really, the idea is that you have to be, in order to be a good content creator, you have to be a good content consumer, right? There's no way around it, right? The third a sort of important takeaway on brands and social is this idea of a global audience, right? So as brands, we think a lot about global. We talk a lot about global. We talk about global expansion in emerging markets. 7.2 billion people in the world today, I believe, is the number from Wikipedia. But of course, as it related to media, we never really thought about media as global. Outside of the World Cup and outside of the Olympics, which happen every 4 years, we never bought media on a global level, and we never really communicated on a global level, right? It was actually impossible in most traditional medium channels like television. And then the internet came around, and the opportunity for global started to exist. But then, of course, you had the fragmentation problem. So this is global social in 2009. And what you could see is Facebook is on the top left. And they are the dominant platform, but there's clearly fragmentation in 2009. Facebook hadn't gone global yet in the way that we know it, of course, today, which is Facebook is the most popular social network in almost every major market in the world. And this is also a reflection of Twitter, right? Twitter is largely now international. LinkedIn came out recently and said that their audience is 65% international. We're seeing the same trending with Tumblr. We're seeing the same trending with Pinterest, right? So you're talking about, for the first time really in history, global audiences, right? And this is a very different way to communicate than how we've thought about communicating in the past. And the important thing to think about when you think about content is whether we like it or not, in many ways, content is global, right? This is Gangnam Style, the most popular video from YouTube last year, right? Not something that was professionally produced in the United States, right? And more, what are the platforms trying to do, right? If you think about Facebook, if you think about Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, they're pushing us to communicate visually, right? Photos translate very well on a global basis, right? People understand visual content in a much better way than, of course, they can understand textual content. And you're seeing platforms start to get us used to, of course, starting to get us used to understanding that we're communicating now on a global basis. And that's the goal, right? That's the promise from Facebook and these other platforms, is you can reach anyone. But of course, it's not just Facebook. And so in 2011, 2012, as brands, we started to think about, is social zero sum, right? Or is it Twitter as well, right? So a lot of times you heard people say, should we do Facebook or Twitter, right? And of course, I think what you started to hear is people said, no, we actually need to do Facebook and Twitter, right? Twitter is too big now to ignore. We need to adopt both channels. But it's not just Facebook or Twitter. It's Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and Pinterest, right? You can't really ignore any of these platforms. They're too massive, and the trending lines show that you need to adopt them. And who is not on this slide, right? The celebration from earlier this week, Tumblr, right? Yahoo, one of the largest traditional digital media properties, absorbing Tumblr, getting into the social game, realizing that the growth was in social as it related to digital. And so the challenge, though, is you can't take your Facebook content and put it on Pinterest, right? You can't even really take your Instagram content and put it on Twitter right now, right? Every platform is unique, and every platform has a certain style. And of course, every platform has a global audience. And you've got to be able to communicate in each one of those in the native format that those audiences want to be communicated with. And the models, and I think this is just starting to come out, right? This is still very new. But the models for all these platforms is they want you to reach a much larger audience, right? We were all up in arms when Facebook started to charge us to reach our audience. But Facebook would also let you reach 1.2 billion people right now. You have to pay them, but there's a way to reach them, right? Twitter is moving this way, and these other platforms are moving this way. And they're forcing us, of course, to think about communicating and creating content in real time for all these audiences. This is how these business models are going to work. Make no mistake about it, right? They're going to let you talk to anyone in the world at any time. You're just going to have to be able to create content that's as relevant and interesting as possible to reach them. The fourth takeaway is just this, which is there's so much content now that is needed to be created to reach all of these global audiences in a specific and interesting way. And your goal as a brand is to live at this intersection, right? This intersection that we've always lived at in order to create great content. So we like to say that great content lives where cultural relevance and brand voice meets, right? That's how every commercial is made. That's how every radio ad is made. That's how every magazine ad is made. And more, that's how every tweet is made. That's how every Facebook status is made, right? When the Super Bowl happened, we got very excited when brands started to communicate in real time about a culturally relevant event, right? The Super Bowl lights going out, with how their brand could basically create a message that was relevant. Oreo talked about dunking in the dark. Audi took a stab at Mercedes-Benz about lights and halogen lights and how their lights were really, of course, better, right? But that's just scratching the surface. This is how great content in social needs to live every single day, right? There's a culturally relevant event for your brand happening right now somewhere around the world, right? There's a time and a moment to capture a specific audience every single day, all day long, right? This world is global, and the way that media is consumed now is 24/7. And so the idea and the great promise, though, is why create all this content is that flow, and the really promise of flow, Facebook's Paul Adams talks about this, he calls this many lightweight interactions, right? The promise is all these little pieces of content you make now, hundreds potentially if you're a global brand on a daily basis, you're getting more engagement back from consumers than almost anywhere else, right? You're getting more lightweight interactions back from people that care about you and care about your brand than you could from any Miller-Brown survey you might do around your television commercial, right? And of course, this data is coming in real time. So the promise of social is that you can start to learn from this. You can start to learn from the hundreds of pieces of content that you make a day globally, and this can be better insights than the research you might buy, off the shelf. And it can lead to better stock content, right? That's the promise. We don't stop making commercials. Let's just make better commercials, right? And let's use social as a proxy to how we think about communicating with our customers in any medium. And to do all this, so to lay out all of those points, right? The idea of audiences now being global, the idea that it's an always-on, 24/7 world that we live in. We live in a world, of course, of pull to refresh, right? PTR, pull to refresh media, streams. There's no bookends anymore. There's no start and finish like there was with a book. Twitter is never ending, Facebook is never ending. Every platform you can think of and where consumers' time and attention is going is never ending. So we have to live in this world of always-on media. And in order to do that, we need to really have a massive shift in the enterprise in terms of how brands are built structurally and how the leaders inside of brands sort of take marketing to the next level. Because the other important point about all of this is that what we're increasingly seeing is brands are more popular than ever. On a global basis, if you look at the fan bases of brands, brands have the largest audiences in social. It's not publishers, it's not celebrities, it's brands, it's Fortune 500 brands, right? So there's a massive opportunity at our hands. And so let's start with the people that really are on the front lines of social, day in, day out. Short form, it's CM, longer form, it's community manager. Who is this community manager, this person that's in charge of content and social for almost any Fortune 500 brand in the world, right? They're sort of the mic piece. They're the people talking to consumers. These are the people that are actually consuming the content on a day-to-day basis. These people have very important jobs as it relates to communicating to audiences in the millions on behalf of brands, right? And it's a role that was really only started with social, right? I mean, you had online forums where you might have had something called a community manager, but really they've come of age inside of an enterprise organization with social. And if you talk to them, which we do a lot of, and you can also just see it, they're incredibly undervalued, right? You look at almost any line item, if you had the opportunity to look at a P&L sheet, and you look at how community managers are paid, you would wonder how they could live in New York City, right? The idea is they're not considered that important inside of most organizations. And it's also a reflection of the idea that social is a younger demographic, particularly, I mean, not really, but you could imagine it could be in terms of understanding how to communicate into it. So you generally have more junior employees, of course, where you're paying them very low rates, to come and be what we think is an incredibly strategic position inside of the organization. This person, this community manager, is on the front lines, again, to outside of maybe your specific product on a day-to-day basis. They're reaching more consumers for your brands than anyone else inside the organization. But of course, this is not negative, right? I think there's a lot of really good news coming for the community manager, right? They will become more strategic inside of the organization. They will become more important because there's a lot of things, there's a lot of winds at their back that are going to help them. And the biggest wind at their back is the CMO, because the CMO owns social, right? The CMO owns the cards to social. And of course, maybe this is sort of a, it's an obvious thing, right? Of course the CMO owns social, but really think about social, right? I mean, yes, the CMO owns social because it's traditionally a marketing and communications channel, and the CMO owns marketing and communication. But social is very, very different than television, than radio, than any other medium the CMO has ever known, right? And for all the reasons that I just was talking about throughout this presentation, right? Socialism is fundamentally different, but the CMO does own it. And so you're seeing a power struggle inside the enterprise between the CIO and the CTO and the CMO, because social is just a much bigger beast than anything the CMO has owned before. And you could also look at how the CMO is benefiting from social. So apologies, this graph reads the wrong way. But what you see is this is the average tenure of the CMO. And the insight you might glean from this graph is the CMO's tenure started to go up when social came about, right? I think that's a pretty easy, and whether this is a correlation can definitely be argued. But the CMO is staying around the enterprise longer, and not just a little bit, right? Tenure has almost doubled since 2007. That's a big jump for a strategic position inside the organization. So now the CMO is all of a sudden much more important inside the organization. It's not just about whether or not your television commercial works. You own the structure for how you talk in social, for how you communicate to your largest audience. And so let's think about what's changed. Let's just recap, because I think we've talked a lot about it. But more and more, the CMO is no longer about campaigns, right? You don't live or die on the TV commercials you make with your advertising agency. We're moving from a world of campaigns to sustained communication, right? It's not just about the big idea and then you're out. You have to show a model of sustaining communication as a CMO. We're moving from a world where reach was defined by cities for these CMOs, right? How you bought media and television, for instance, to reach defined by continents, right? Your ability to make an impression around the world is much bigger than ever before, of course. Where content was something that you bought that was $3 million, right, for every commercial, and you distribute it for $20 million, to a world of pull-to-refresh media that's always on. And really, you're moving from, as a CMO, from buying media to building systems, right? That's the biggest structural change, is you're no longer a media buyer. You're a builder of systems inside of the organization. And this shift, of course, requires a new mindset, and hope maybe even different people. But I think this is also really just a mindset for how the future of social is going to work. And so CMOs must think in systems to scale their global social content, and they have to help the CM, the community manager, succeed. These two people, outside of the titles just being one letter apart, are now very strategically aligned to the future health of both of their businesses, right? And so we see a future with how much strategic implications are now on the CMO, with the CM has to be looking at becoming the chief marketing officer, right? What is the more important position in 2013 to the structure of the marketing organization than social, right? And who is more important than that community manager? And if this shift is going to occur, which we start to see happening, there's another shift that's going to occur, which is as branding becomes more and more important to how you build and sell your products, there, of course, is this opportunity for a CMO that understands systems and is product-minded to, of course, become the CEO of the organization, the most strategic person inside of the organization, ideally. So that's the promise of brands and social, right? That's the promise that's before all of us that work in this world and that work for brands or work with brands and, of course, work inside of social. So, of course, I, as an entrepreneur, want to make this happen, and I hope you all do too. And I appreciate you giving me time at 8:30 in the morning. So thank you very much.